Okay, so we are ready for our last Native American group. We're here with the Arctic. It's a very interesting group. It is very different from all of the other groups. It's the most different from the other groups. There's no other group that's quite like it, but there's also no other group that lives in a place quite like this either. So, um, first off, if you need to pause the video around now to make sure you have all of your supplies or to get everything, you should have your Native American map and Native American study chart page. And then you also need a purple for our map today. So if you don't have those two things, pause the video, go get that now. If you do have those things, great. We've got our map over here. We also only have one section left, and we know it's the Arctic, so it would make sense that it would be the very top of our page, right? So on your map, like I said, we're going to use purple today. So go ahead and get your purple. We're going to color in the box next to 6 with our purple. And then we are going to put Arctic. And then we're going to color in the purple section. Now be careful when you're doing this because the purple section is, this map I feel like doesn't quite do it justice. It kind of cuts some of it off, but it goes all the way across this dotted line. And then you notice it skips kind of right here and it goes over to here too. So there's kind of two parts to this section. Again, remember I'm doing this on a computer, so just kind of bear with me a little bit for my coloring skills on a mouse pad. But all of this needs to be purple. You're going to be so much faster at this than I am. Oh, gosh, that's okay. But I want to do all of this because I want to make sure you know where all to color. Really, the big thing is making sure that you have both sides. You'll notice that this is none of these groups actually lived in what we call the continental United States now. Continental United States just means everything except for Alaska and Hawaii. And these groups did live in part of what is now the United States. Again, remember these groups were here way before Canada and the United States were countries. So we can't really say that they lived in Canada or they lived in the United States at this time. They do now. But this area over here is Alaska, right? Parts of this is in Alaska. So they did live in part of what is now the United States. Just at the time it wasn't. And I think you probably already have some ideas as to what their life might be like, especially when we're looking at our questions in the environment section. I would imagine you could probably already pick out some of the things we would use for environment. Okay, that is not the best coloring I have ever done, but those are the sections. That's the part that you need to make sure is colored in purple. So if you need to pause the video, I would imagine you're much faster than I am. But if you needed to pause the video here to finish filling in the map, you can do so. If not, you're going to flip your paper over. And we are going to remind ourselves of what we're looking for in our reading today. So we're going to look for transportation. We're going to look for food, shelter, environment, and then anything else that is of importance or just seems interesting to us. So let's get back in here and let's get started. So the Arctic region obviously is located around the North Pole. It's very, very far north. It includes parts of Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Russia. And this territory was home to a lot of tribes. I feel like of all the groups, I feel like these tribe names were some of the harder ones to pronounce. I'm calling it the Aleut, the Yupik, and the Inuit. The Inuit actually we've already talked about when we talked about like the mound builders. So the Inuit was a group. They also are sometimes called Eskimos. However, when you ask the indigenous or native people in this area, they kind of consider that to be disrespectful to their heritage. So we'll try not to use the term Eskimos and we'll call them indigenous peoples or Arctic Native Americans. And indigenous just means the same as native. It means original. That's where they started. And they lived in small family bands, which kind of makes sense. It would be really difficult to have a place where you have lots and lots of people, because the more people you have, the more people you have to feed. And this was a place where it was definitely difficult to find food. These were the last groups that came over. Remember way, way back at the beginning when we talked about the land bridge and how people may have come over by land bridge or maybe even by boat. These would have been some of the last native groups to come to North America. Hostile groups were in some of the other regions. We have talked about how a lot of the other groups had problems between themselves, or, they always had to be prepared for an attack from another group. So these people decided, you know what, we're going to live up here where it's difficult to live and people are going to leave us alone. We don't have to worry about fighting or, being under attack by another group. So they wanted to be peaceful. Each member helped to survive the harsh cold. Really, everybody had to have a pretty strict job, because if they didn't, really their survival counted on it. So they were strict on the division of jobs, meaning everybody had their role, everybody had their job, and they were expected to do it well. So men hunted and built homes. Women took care of the children, homes, and clothing. Not many things were considered personal property, meaning pretty much everything was shared by everybody. Items were shared when they were needed. So not even that items were shared between families, but items would have been shared between anybody that was within their community. Because again, it was all about survival. So anything that would help somebody else, they are going to get it, right? No questions asked. Before a government was made, the Inuit tribe didn't really have any laws, and they weren't really an organized society. They voluntarily appointed a leader who showed good qualities. So it was kind of in the middle between like the Northwest Coast that we talked about, who didn't have democracy, right? They had like wealthy people that ruled, and then democracy. So in this case, they really only needed a leader when there was really something going wrong. And other than that, they weren't super organized. Really, their main focus was just on survival, so they didn't really have to worry about other problems arising or things that they were going to have to do within the tribes. The Arctic people live in what is called a polar desert. So it is a frigid climate. Frigid meaning extremely cold. So not like our winters where they get pretty cold. This is like the extreme. It's all flat and treeless. So when we say polar desert, it's like when you think of a desert, you think of sand and dry and hot and not a lot of plant life or animal life, right? This is the exact same thing, only the opposite side of the temperature scale. So when we say a polar desert, there's no trees, there's not a lot of animals that are living there, there's not a whole lot of things surviving because the climate is so incredibly cold. When I say incredibly cold, there's actually permafrost, which means there is ground that is never thawed. It is always frozen. So even if the top unfreezes a little bit, like the top layer of the soil or the top layer of the ground underneath, it's still ice or frozen ground. That's that cold. It can actually even reach temperatures that are negative 60 degrees Celsius, which is somewhere around like negative 75 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm going to let that sink in for a minute. Negative 75. It's a bad winter if we ever get temps that are like in the negatives at all. So there are random days where we'll have like a wind chill that's like -2. This is negative 75. That is bitter cold. It also has really few food resources, which makes sense because obviously no plants are growing in this, right? But at the same time, if it's this difficult for people to live there, it is not an easy place for animals to live either. So food was scarce, which meant that it was not around a lot. The high country, like we said, had permanent ice and snow. Some of the lowlands had a few grasses, a few shrubs, and in the summer months, they might have some things like some berries, but they really couldn't rely on plants. They had to rely on animals and different species of animals that made this area their home, as well as some of the animals that made their home in the water, in the cold, cold water. So think about that. If the land is negative 75, the water, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. But there are a lot more animals that can survive in the cold, cold water than on the cold, cold land. So they had a lot of marine life that they could hunt or fish for. So let's stop here for just a second and fill in what we know. So first off, for environment, we can say polar desert, right? Super cold, no trees, flat land, super duper cold. And we could even say frigid. Let me spell it right. There we go. Frigid. Okay. What else do we have? We don't have anything about transportation yet. We can kind of guess maybe. Food. We definitely know animals. And then I'm going to put marine life. So marine life just means things that live in the water. We might be able to add to that, but we know animals and marine life are pretty much the main two food sources. They did say sometimes there were berries in the summer months, depending on where they lived. So they could be somewhat gatherers. So we'll add that there too. Okay. I think also for other important information, we could say strict jobs. So in order for people to survive, everybody had to have their job and do their job well. Okay, also I am going to go through these kind of fast, so if you ever need to pause the video to fill in your chart because I went too quick, that's fine. Pause the video and then hop right back in when you're ready to go. The early Arctic peoples adapted to this difficult way of life, meaning that they changed their habits and their lifestyle to be able to live in this area. They were really good hunters and fishermen. There were a few plants that they gathered in the summer months, like we talked about with the berries, right? And this meant early people had really to just rely on meat and fish for food. They hunted caribou. Caribou is like a reindeer, very similar to a reindeer. Musk oxen, which I've got a picture of those because I just think they're kind of cool looking. It's almost like a cross between like a ram, like a sheep, and like the bison that we talked about, or a buffalo, right? Just kind of interesting looking little animals, but they almost look like they're kind of built for really cold weather, right? These animals that we're going to be talking about are definitely built for cold weather. Arctic hares are like rabbits, right? Polar bears, different kinds of birds that can survive in the really cold climate. They also hunted sea animals, so we talked about that marine life. So whales, walruses, seals, salmon, whitefish. Mammals that had a lot of fat on them, things that would keep them warm. We talked about blubber and the whales for the northwest coast. It was the same thing here, right? Some sea mammals could only be hunted in the summer months because they went elsewhere when it got too cold. And they would also smoke their meat. This helped them so that they could store it for the winter months. We had talked about that before with like, they would make almost kind of like jerky out of the meat so that it would last for a long time because if they kept it fresh. Obviously they did have some cold. So because the weather was so cold, it was almost like their own little refrigerators or freezers, but they would still only last for so long. So smoking the meat would help. Some of the Arctic people were and still are known for eating raw food, which is very interesting. I know this is kind of off topic here, but I did see a documentary where it showed some people that are still living today that have ties to these Arctic Native Americans that will still eat like raw whale, raw seals, raw sea life, just because that's kind of like their belief. Their belief is that uncooked food saves fuel and gives their diet nutrients that cooking would destroy, like that the heat would destroy. So, and also when they say like saves fuel, it means it saves the fuel of cooking the animals in the first place. So they didn't have to do that. Ooh, sorry, had to take a drink. Okay, the people of the Arctic region were creative and resourceful. They would have to be, right? To live and survive in that type of area, they would really have to be. So they used animal bones to make harpoons. We saw harpoons yesterday with the Northwest Coast Native Americans, right? Those things would be used for like hunting the whales and the seals and the sea lions. Fish spears, bows and arrows, and fish hooks they would create. They used seal oil to cook meat, kind of like how we use olive oil now to cook things. They would use seal oil or whale oil, and they would also use them to warm their homes. So they would be able to create fires or use lamps, and they would use that oil to help keep their homes warm. They made waterproof clothing from seal and walrus intestines. Sounds pretty gross, but a pretty smart idea. This kept them dry from freezing water and rain. They also created parkas. So let's find those. So parkas, we even hear that used now, but parkas are just like really, really thick winter coats. So if you notice, most of them are made out of animal fur. They would have lots of layers. They obviously were meant to keep people from freezing. Notice the hoods too. The hoods were very important to try to keep their face and their heads warm in this really difficult climate to live in. And they would use the caribou fur, like the reindeer fur, to keep warm. The parkas was often be removed to sleep. And this was an important thing. So sweating is not good in this climate. And you might think, okay, well, you would want to be warm. Why would sweating be a big deal? That's because anything wet freezes. It is so incredibly cold there that water just really doesn't last too long. I mean, obviously they had the water in the ocean, but like water on your body would freeze to your body. And since it would freeze to your body, it could cause your body temperature to drop even lower. So they wouldn't want to be too warm at times. They wouldn't want to do too much with those big heavy parkas on, especially when it was in a place like their home that was warmer. They also created a sacred drum. This was made by stretching animal skins across a hoop, and it was used in ceremonies. They made soapstone carvings while hanging, just like all of the Native Americans that we had talked about. Art was an important part of their customs and their beliefs and their heritage. So let's stop there and see what we can add. Okay, so strict jobs. You could add something about parkas. You could add something about the harpoons, the sacred drum, right? We already said that we knew they were sea animals, marine life, and those kinds of things were important as far as food goes. I don't think we heard anything about transportation. We still haven't heard anything about shelter yet. So let's wait. Let's keep on going. The early people lived in different homes throughout the year. So during the summer, when they roamed inland for fresh water and fishing and game hunting, they lived as nomads. There's a couple things that I want to talk about here. When they talk about roaming inland, I want to show us our map. Inland means like away from the water. So if they lived right here on the water most of the time, as it got warmer, they could actually move in farther into this mainland because there would be animals in the summer because it wasn't quite so cold. So they would move farther and farther away from the water. And nomads just mean, we've talked about nomads before. The people of the Great Plains were also nomads, which means they didn't really have one place to live. They would move often. So these groups moved often, and they relied on temporary tents made from caribou hides and wooden poles. So it would have been really kind of similar to teepees. We've talked about this with the Inuit before, but they had kayaks and umaks. Those are similar to canoes, and I've got a picture of those. So they kind of look like the canoes or the, let's see, Native American kayaks. So we talked about the kayaks being a little different, right? Look pretty similar to what we would use now, but they were the ones that actually invented this type of transportation, these kayaks, right? So we have them to thank. And they would wrap them in animal skin to kind of make them watertight, and they would travel by water. They did have permanent homes and villages that were made for the long winter, because once winter came, unless they had to go out for food, they were pretty much in their homes all of the time because it was the warmest way. It was how they could survive those negative 75-degree temperatures. So some tribes lived in igloos. We've probably all seen a picture of igloos before, and they look exactly like what you think. And you might be thinking, okay, Mrs. Guard, if you are living in a cold place, how would making a home out of ice make sense? That's a good question. Like we had talked about before, when you can dig into the ground a little bit, it does keep you a little bit warmer when it's cold out, so they would have done that. And then ice is also an insulator when it's packed in blocks like they would do. Insulation means that it holds in the heat. So obviously your body puts off heat. So when they would get inside those igloos, when they would get in the igloos, their body would be putting off heat, but that dome shape and the ice would kind of like make the heat bounce back off the walls and be contained within the igloo. So it was a way to heat those things up, which is pretty cool. Other tribes lived in sod houses made with rocks. Let me see if I can find those. So this would have been in places where it wasn't, where they could find some grasses. They could have made sod homes. It almost kind of looks like the mound builders that we had talked about, but there were groups that were able to make sod homes as well, grass homes as well. And they were built around a pit, like we said, they dig into the ground because it would help keep them warmer. In frozen condition, dog sleds were used for travel, and dog sleds are still used today. They're used actually quite often. This was another one of those groups that would tame, just like the Great Plains, kind of tamed or domesticated some of the dogs so that they could use them. This group did the exact same thing. So they would have taken wild dogs or even wolves in some cases and domesticated them, turned them into animals they could use. So we have a couple of things there. So the first thing we could put for housing, did I put that in the right spot? Yeah. They had tents that they would use when they would move. They had tents. They had igloos that they would use during the winter months. And then they also had sod homes, sod houses, for those of them that lived in warmer areas. Now I say warmer because they still weren't very warm, but they were warmer than some areas, right? We also talked about a lot of transportation. So there were three different ways they got around. So obviously they walked on foot. All of our groups used those good old feet. They had boats, so they had kayaks / and I want to make sure, umaks, I forget now how I said it. I would have to look up the pronunciation to be positive, but UMIAK. Yes. Okay. So those canoe type boats. And then finally dog sleds, which sounds super fun, and I'm super jealous that I would love to go do that. I think that would be really cool. Okay, the Arctic people have many traditional beliefs and customs. Animalism is the religious belief that all natural objects have souls and spirits. So this includes animals, plants, rocks, thunder, rain, mountains, and rivers. So things that we wouldn't necessarily consider to be alive. Animalists believe that they all have a soul or a spirit, no matter if they are believed to be alive or not. A lot of the indigenous or native people have a deep respect for the spirit of the animals they hunt. So especially in an area like this, think if you only see an animal come by once every so often, you are going to be very grateful to that animal because it's going to give you obviously food, but it's going to give you a lot of other things. Maybe warmth if you were to create clothing out of it, tools, supplies, all of those things. So they had a very, very deep respect for the animals they hunted. They also believed that illnesses and hardships were caused by misconduct or displeased spirits, meaning that if something bad happened to them, they feel like it's because they didn't do something correctly, or there was a spirit of one of those things we were talking about, like an animal, a plant, a rock, something in nature that was not happy with them or displeased. So some treatments included atonement. Atonement just means to say you're sorry. So if they feel like the reason that they're ill is because they weren't treating some of the animals with respect, then they would go and make amends, or they would say sorry and hope that would help them to feel better. A lot of these ceremonies were led by shaman. We talked about shaman yesterday. Shaman were those doctors, people that were believed to help speak to the spirits. We talked about that drum earlier, like the sacred drum, right? So there's a drum that they would use in some of their ceremonies to help make amends or make up with some of the spirits. They used charms, dances to communicate with the spirit world, and during ceremonies, shamans would wear masks to represent humans and animals, and the masks were believed to enable communication with the spirits. So really the shaman's job was to connect with the spirits that were causing this issue, whether it was a hardship or an illness, and try to come to an agreement some way that the person could feel better. Finally, other traditions, they valued listening and Inuit vocal games. I am not going to show you a video on here, but if you have the time, look up Inuit vocal games. I think some of you will really get a kick out of it. It's actually a really cool thing. I know that you've probably all watched a YouTube video that's a try not to laugh video. Some of the vocal games would literally be making different types of throat noises, and you'll hear, if you look up Inuit vocal games, you'll see like Inuit throat singing. It is not what we consider, or not what you would think singing is. It's a lot of breathing, it's a lot of like deep stomach noises. But they would use those throat singing things and they would continue singing until one person would laugh, which I think is kind of a fun game, and one that we would probably play too. But if you have a minute after you get finished with this module, I would look up Inuit vocal games, or maybe I'll even throw a video in at the end of this if you wanted to look at it. Listening is the most important tradition in many Arctic peoples. They pay very close attention to an elder telling a story. They hold super still. They believe this improves self-discipline, positive thinking, and cognitive ability. So cognitive ability just means like your brain's ability to think. So they felt like paying really close attention and listening really well when, especially elders, people that were older than them, were talking. It would help them to become more positive, become smarter, and have more discipline. Imagery is also enhanced and good for the mind. The Inuit people play vocal games. This is called throat singing, right? It's a wide range of sounds that produce deep in the chest and the throat. I will see if I can find a video and I'll throw that in the end of the module. That'll be optional, so if you don't want to look at it, that's fine too. But I think those, a couple things that we could add here. So I think the animalists, so like that religious belief that everything has a spirit and that they're, really deeply respectful of the animals and nature. I also think adding listening, because they said that is one of the biggest qualities, one of the most important things to their group, listening. And then if you want to put vocal games, I think that one's kind of a cool one too. All right, guys, we're finished, or we should be finished. We've got all 6 groups. We've kind of dipped our toe into the waters that is the Native Americans of North America. Like I said, remember, I purposely didn't give you everything about all of these groups because we're going to be starting a Native Americans project that I'm super excited about. But this at least gives us some background on all of these groups. And tomorrow I'm probably going to ask you a question about maybe which group you think was your favorite, or maybe what were your top 2 favorite groups or most interesting groups. So you might start thinking about that. I'm not going to do that today, but make sure you kind of think about like which of these do you really want to know more about? Because I know there's some of these that you want to know more about, or you've got some questions. So which ones would that be? If you are completely finished with this, that means you have your map and this page finished. This can go in the tray in our classroom. So if you're in Mrs. Harshman's class, it goes in the Harshman tray. Mrs. Young's class in the Young tray. Mrs. Guard's class in the Guard tray. If you are not completely finished with it, then I would hold on to it. If you want to put it in the tray, you can, and then come back to get it. But I am going to be grading these. So if there's a section that you do not have finished, you are responsible for finishing that. Other than that, I think that's it. You're ready to head on to the next part of the module for today.